TV, a panel examining the historical scholarship of David Reynolds, author of biographies of John Brown and Walt Whitman, and histories of the mid-19th century. This is about 2 hours.
Good afternoon. I would like to welcome you to the proceedings. I'm sorry I'm coming in at the last moment. Made a tactical error of getting into a cab, sitting in the middle of Fifth Avenue for a long time. My name is Annette Gordon-Reed, and I am the moderator of this panel. I think I might have a shot at saying a few things as well in addition to moderating, but you've come here to hear people who are much more well qualified than I to talk about this. They are connected to the author and know him better than I do, but I'm an admirer from afar, having done a review of his book, Mightier Than the Sword, for The New Yorker, and have admired him far, having done a review of his book, Mightier Than the Sword, for The New Yorker, and have admired him, as I said, from afar, but I think this is the first time we've met, perhaps, and I'm very, very happy to be here. We have a distinguished group of panelists. We start with people who are well known to you. Bill Kelly, who's the president of CUNY and is a distinguished American scholar of literature. We were going to be starting with Sean Wilentz right here, who is the Sid and Ruth Lapidus professor of American history at Princeton. Sorry, I'm still a little out of breath. I'm literally running with a torn muscle in my thigh. Limping about here. He is well known to all of you. He is the author of numerous books, including the Bancroft Prize-winning The Rise of American Democracy, Jefferson to Jackson. He's also a political commentator, had something to say about the 14th Amendment not long ago in the New York Times, and I will talk to him about the feedback that he got back from that on that particular piece. We also have Robert Reid-Pharr, who is also known to all of you. His first book, his specialty is queer studies, and his latest book is Once You Go Black, the Black American Intellectuals in America, and he is also a distinguished scholar here. We have Brenda Wineapple, who I just found out is a neighbor of mine, and I'm very happy to have had a lunch with her a couple of times, living there on the Upper West Side. She is the author of Ecstatic Nation, most recently of Ecstatic Nation, a book about the really pivotal years after the Civil War when America was remaking itself. And I think it's especially fitting to have her here talking about culture and all of the various ways that all the things that went into making the American nation, which is the subject of David's work and what I've admired so much about it. I think we're supposed to have 10 to 12 minutes apiece that we'll do. That's good enough, and then David will respond. David, we know who he is. We're here to celebrate his book, celebrate his work beneath the American Renaissance after 25 years, to see the enormous influence that that book has had on cultural studies and the writing of history and politics, the political history of the United States since then. And I think Sean has you with the forward to the newest version of it. So you are the person who will go forward and get started. Okay. Get it started. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Annette. Can you all hear me? Is that all right? I don't want to have to bend down. Can you all hear me all right? Do I need this for TV or something? Or no? Okay, good. Great. It's great to be here. It's great to celebrate David's book. I get to do this twice, right, having written 2 years ago. In fact, 2 years ago, I had the honor and privilege to write a brief foreword to a new edition of Beneath the American Renaissance, David's book. My main point was that the book had shifted the locus of reading in coming to terms with the great American writers of the pre-Civil War years. First, the book expanded the canon, simply enough, expanded the canon to include Edgar Allan Poe and Emily Dickinson, alongside Emerson, Thoreau, Hawthorne, Melville, and Whitman. Among other things, the book talked about how the writing of the American Renaissance did some very odd things, because it was drawing on some very odd things. How it was able to fuse in new ways the sensational and the rational to create, for example, in Poe's stories, a figure of cool brilliance, the brainy detective who could uphold morality against the cool, brilliant, amoral criminal. period also experienced, we sort of knew this before, but never as deeply. It experienced a women's literary renaissance, more multifarious and at times much bleaker than the didactic romance of the cult of domesticity, a less cheery renaissance that helped to inspire Emily Dickinson's tonal fusions and shocking images. Second, and implicit in what I just said, Reynolds vastly expanded the terrain of the era's popular literary imagination, or our understanding of that terrain, which in turn altered our sense of the great writer's connections to American culture. The revolt against gentility that each of these authors supposedly undertook was at once much richer and less cut off from the rest of the American imaginative writing scene than previous critics had imagined. Drawing upon the dark strains of an enormous popular literature, and I mean enormous, the amount of reading that went into this. No one has read more bad things, I think, in American literature than David Reynolds. I say that, as I say, that as a very high compliment. Got a very strong stomach, among other things. So drawing upon this enormous popular literature, by turns murderous, erotic, and rebellious, what Reynolds calls work of the subversive imagination, these writers were far more rooted in American writing than the standard accounts of their rejection of early American Victorian gentility had allowed. In other words, they weren't revolting against America, they were part of America that no one had bothered to look at before. This other America. They stood less as heroic naysayers to European imitation or uplifting Whig moralism than as the champions of broader American currents that limbed human depravity, urban horror, truculent street politics, and social carnival, and which they used to raise levels of what would have seemed to be a previous generation, and seemed to many of their contemporaries, an impossibility. A democratic, high American literary art. I concluded in that introduction with some brief remarks about how Reynolds' book offered, as never before, both a map and a method for understanding the American origins of so much of modern contemporary American writing, mentioning Pynchon, Roth, and Bob Dylan, I always get him in, among the subversive imaginers that are still at it. Well, I have little to say to add to all of that. So maybe I'll just sit down and have you read that, but no. I could elaborate on some of that today, remarking, for example, on just how widely David ranged in his readings, as I said before, including visual as well as literary examples. David was one of the first to actually look at how the presentation of pamphlets, pictures on pamphlets, were part of the subversive imagination. So it's not simply the word, it's the pictures, and the words that you don't ordinarily read, the words on the front page. Instead, I'd like, with your indulgence, to offer some more personal reflections about the world from which beneath the American Renaissance emerged and the work that it pioneered. 40 years ago, in a graduate seminar on intellectual and cultural history, I wrote my first research paper. I had stumbled upon an odd volume from 1849 called The Mysteries and Miseries of New York by one Edward Zane Carroll Judson. I was already deeply interested in the social history of working in lower class New York City, but this was a seminar on intellectual and cultural history, so I had to do something about literature. I seized upon this book and tried to make sense of it as a piece of social commentary, as well as a popular literary form. Soon enough, I learned that Judson was the real name of the raconteured Ned Buntline, who would go on after the Civil War to become the king of the dime novel, above all in his early tales of Buffalo Bill Cody. I also learned of how Judson's work was of a piece with other writing documenting the world of the Bowery and the other rough strongholds of antebellum Manhattan, ranging from the plays of Frank Chanfrau to the social description of the experienced carver, George Foster. And I learned something of the European background to the mysteries and misery genre, subjecting myself, I remember, to reading much more Eugène Sue than I ever care to remember, including Les Misères de Paris, obviously a forerunner of Judson's episodic serial of New York slums. It's superior, that's not saying a whole lot. The paper never quite came together, it didn't come together at all. I floundered about from imagining it as a work of reformism to a kind of Grub Street potboiler. And once the seminar was over, I simply abandoned Where I gave up in callow confusion, David, working way out there in Berkeley, found a huge American literature, and made sense of it. And after his early work on George Lepard, went on to write Beneath the American Renaissance, and then his book on Walt Whitman, which I think is also pertinent to today's conversation. It took someone with his own literary imagination and literary training to see entire worlds that a history graduate students, at least at Yale at that time, could barely touch. But I raised this old and not entirely flattering story to make two simple observations about where David's book came from and what it has meant. First, most obviously, David's youthful scholarly interests were part of an entire generation of American historians and critics. We wanted to write an undiscovered history, the history of unsung working people, and slaves and farmers, and everyone else given relatively short shrift by previous generations of scholars. We came at it from a variety of angles. Marxism of various varieties, from Althusserian to neo-Marxist humanism, E.B. Thompson, particularly influential in my circles. But we found a common inspiration to get beneath not just the American Renaissance, but the crust of all of American history. Beneath the idea, happy or sad, depending on your perspective, of a fundamental liberal consensus in the nation's political and social life, of a nation driven by the imperatives and the paucity of middle-class striving. We were looking for revolt, resistance, turmoil, libertinism, impudence. That is, it struck me, we were looking for ourselves. Or a history that was not so much useful in providing lessons for the future as it was in grounding us in an American past from which we felt alienated, an American past we could then call our own as being at least familiar. Some of us found what we were looking for in long-forgotten political movements and struggles. Others found it in the histories of the vast majority of the population that had either been slighted or unwritten entirely, notably the history of African Americans and the history of women. Much of this work carved out and then settled into its own intellectual and academic grooves, which now have come to dominate the study of the American past. In place of the orthodoxy of liberal consensus came a new orthodoxy, in which America could best be understood by the triad of race, gender, and class, with the third a kind of add-on to give the revisionist efforts a frisson of old-time Marxist dissent. It is, I think, impossible to understand beneath the American Renaissance outside of this intellectual context, this intellectual history. But it is equally impossible to understand it outside of David's decision to connect the new social and literary history that he was finding with the canonical figures in American literature. This was not the universal impulse, or any universal impulse at the time. Much of the iconoclastic, or would-be iconoclastic scholarship of our generation divorced itself from the recognized political as well as literary greats, receiving its most vulgar expression in the condescension, if not outright hostility, to those denounced as dead white European males, as if being white, European, and male, let alone dead, was a sure marker of malice, at the very least, complicity in the imperial oppression of the world's masses. I need not go into all the ways the scholarship moved from rediscovering those who had been in the phrase of the day, hidden from history, to a neglect, if not an active demonization of those who had not been. No small part of the culture wars, outside as well as inside the academy, sprang from this shift. My point is simply to make, my simple point, it has to do with David's decisions to return to the great writers of not only what might be the greatest phase in American literature, illuminating their work with all he discovered about the Lepards and the John Neals and the Fanny Ferns. David did not praise the low in lieu of or at expense of the high, the cognate of what in political history has become known as what Jim Oakes, who's in the room, has called the cult of true radicalism. Nor did he seek to imprison the work of the canonical writers in the penitentiary of academic theory, including the tyrannical triumvirate of race, class, and gender. Instead, he performed a remarkable act of integration that did not collapse the categories of high and low, let alone denigrate the former in favor of the latter, so much as to open up new ways of seeing how one grew out of the other. That other, above and beyond, say, settling the speech, imaginations of the great writers of the American Renaissance, how they grew and amalgamated and made art out of the loam of popular writing and popular culture generally. Loam previously either ignored or dismissed as detritus. One testimony to David's worth, I think, is that of the co-panelists right here that I'm so delighted to be with here. Working from very different places, all of them have managed to expand our understanding of every level of the American past by bringing into play the hitherto dismissed or unmentionable, but with a decent respect for what might be called the higher strata of American art, culture, and politics. They have, at one level, explored circuits and cultural fusions which make sense of American literature in particular as distinctive as any other. And each, in his or her own way, has cracked open new realms of weirdness, of what is essentially a strange American culture, including a strange American political culture, as has been on display for the last 2 weeks, better than I can possibly explain. A culture of odd juxtapositions, odd liaisons, of magical flights, of coarse endeavors, all the archetypes, comic and tragic, all the archetypes that even the Coen brothers have yet to come close to elaborating. I must say in candor that I admire some of these explorations of David's more than others. Indeed, in David's work, I suppose I find his plumbing of John Brown's weirdness less compelling than that of, say, Walt Whitman's weirdness or Edgar Allan Poe's weirdness. But to David, we owe an enormous debt in showing how, just as we cannot understand American weirdness without understanding the nation's great writers, so those writers are inexplicable without a deep and discriminating knowledge of American weirdness. Thank you.
I'm not next. You.
I believe I am. Good afternoon. It's a real privilege and pleasure to be here. I want to thank David for inviting me, including me on this panel with friends new and old. I began by saying that I have a deep-set contempt for what I think of as the flyby, the irritating, borderline, insulting practice of pledging to give a talk, flying by, say a few things, and then bolt for the door, citing some pressing engagement. When I was the president here, I pledged not to do that, and I believe I never did. But here I am, beginning with an apology for saying a few words and then bolting for the door. We are currently in the midst of budget season at the City University. There are several ongoing issues that need to be resolved before meeting with the Department of Budget folks in Albany on Monday and Tuesday. So I hope you'll excuse my rudeness and chalk it up to a desire to make certain that the lights stay on and people's checks don't bounce. I am here, however, briefly to salute David and to celebrate the 25th anniversary of Beneath the American Renaissance, and more broadly, David's extraordinary work and career. It is a privilege and a pleasure to do both. David asked me to say a few words that would contextualize Beneath the American Renaissance within the trajectory of American literary criticism, and I am happy to do so. Let me begin by returning not to 1988 and the publication of Beneath the American Renaissance, but to 1941 and the publication of F.O. Matheson's magisterial, The American Renaissance, Art and Expression in the Age of Emerson and Whitman. That book, as most of you will know, is remarkable for many things, not the least of which is its setting of an American canon at a moment in which there was little place for American writing in the university curriculum, a period in which canon meant major works of British literature written primarily before 1900. Matheson always pressed against that canon. His first book was about Sarah Orne Jewett. The book prior to this one was about T.S. Eliot, who, along with the rest of the modernists, occupied a somewhat liminal space within the literary canon of 1941. Matheson's list of great writers, as you know, was tightly circumscribed: Hawthorne, Melville, Emerson, Thoreau, and Whitman, white, male, Eastern, writers who traded in complexity, ambiguity, and the metaphysical. Implicit in Matheson's privileging of these writers, signaled of course in his title, was the separate but equal status of American cultural history, a heritage yoked to that of Britain, but one which simultaneously laid claim to an autonomous nationalism Shakespeare on the Merrimack, Milton in Nantucket, if you will. As you know, Matheson's Renaissance was inflected by his status as a fellow traveler in the leftist politics of the 1930s, a gay man in closeted Cambridge, devout Christian at pains to reconcile his faith with socialist principles, a formalist critic writing cultural history. Little wonder that his account of American writing between 1850 and 1855 seeks reconciliation at every turn. The American past and the American present find common ground, textual dissonances are resolved, universal themes emerge from brilliantly turned exegesis. Matheson's frontispiece, the frontispiece of the first edition of American Renaissance, is a remarkable daguerreotype of Donald Mackay, builder of the Flying Cloud and other American clipper ships. That choice, it seems to me, speaks to Matheson's synthesizing vision. It reveals, he wrote, the type of character with which the writers of the age were most concerned, the common man in his heroic stature, or as Whitman called the new type, man in the open air. Matheson, of course, was caught up in the Cold War politics that followed the war. In 1947, he delivered the inaugural lecture at the Salzburg Seminar, a U.S.-sponsored Marshall Plan of the Mind, an effort to regenerate the corrupted intellect of Europe. In the service of that enterprise, Matheson and his contemporaries crafted a case for American exceptionalism, a particularity forged by New World circumstance predicated on regeneration and radical individualism. Matheson's experience with Cold War politics had a most unhappy outcome. Targeted for his socialist politics and his leadership of the Harvard Teachers Union, he was hounded by anti-communist zealots, attacks that may or may not have contributed to his suicide in 1950. The note he left behind read, "I am depressed over world conditions. I am a Christian and a socialist. I am against any order which interferes with that objective." The thrust of Matheson's methodology continued to inform American literary criticism throughout the 2 decades that followed his death. The rise of the myth and symbol school of American criticism, and here I think of R.W.B. Lewis's The American Adam, Henry Nash Smith's The Virgin Land, Leslie Fiedler's Love and Death in the American Novel, Roderick Nash's Wilderness in the American Mind, Leo Marx's Machine in the Garden, Richie Slotkin's Regeneration Through Violence, and a dozen others, defined the literary historicism of the time. Each of those texts predicated their reading of the American past on the identification of a unifying trope of national identity. Frequently at odds with the reigning formalism of English departments, Americanist organized American studies programs and departments, a few of them funded by the CIA, all committed to an interdisciplinary quest for the determining levers of the national psyche. That approach was disrupted, of course, by the rise of theory in the wake of 1968, the thrust that Sean just so concisely and brilliantly described, the coming of the culture wars in the 70s and 80s, deconstruction, feminism, structuralism in their post and post-post iterations, challenged the fundamental assumptions of Matheson and his descendants. Exegesis designed to tease out textual unities, the privileging of the true, the beautiful, and the universal, yielded to a hermeneutics of suspicion. As Sean noted, we all look for ourselves. Texts were no longer registers of stable identity, personal or national, but objects of interrogation, sites for demonstrating the tangled workings of power. Resultant attention to matters of gender, race, and class, the Holy Trilogy of the day, Holy Family, I guess, introduced new writers, themes, geographies, and chronologies to American literary study, first expanding, then exploding conventional notions of canonicity. A focus on the cultural work accomplished by literary text rather than on their realized beauties became a dominant concern. In that regard, I'd note in particular Jane Tompkins' Sensational Designs and Kathy Davidson's Revolution and the Word. But for our purposes today, the most significant innovation of the decade was New Historicism, a school of analysis centered around representations. As you all know, the influential cultural journal founded in 1983 by Stephen Greenblatt and Svetlana Alpers, published by the University of California Press. Most reductively put, I apologize for that, New historicists distinguished their work from old historicism on the basis of their attention to the forms of power, the power of forms, chiasmus, the trope of the day, endless Xings and crossings and clever repetitions. Old historicism tried to assign causality to the relation between history read as background and art read as foreground. Implicit in that exercise was a belief in a stable core of meaning in high literature, coherence, consistency, the monologic. New historicism conversely emphasized conflict, disjunction, textual dissonance, biloquism. Nod to Charles Brockton Brown there. Where old historicists gravitated to the great men of history, new historicists privileged those on the lower rungs, the marginalized, the anecdotal, trumped the grand narrative of battles, elections, social movements. Another frequently invoked chiasmus, the historicity of text and the textuality of history, speaks to the Foucauldian assumptions that animated that school of thought, deauthorize, destabilize, expose the constructed character of the historical record. Followed to its logical ends, that approach yielded a relativism that embraced radical indeterminacy, a nihilism that at times pointed inexorably toward an epistemological quagmire. But the most accomplished of the new historicists bailed out long before that dead end. They recognized that skepticism did not require a plunge into the meaninglessness. Via the archive and thick description, a deeply textured overlay of anecdote, accounts, narratives, stories, the kinds of accounts that Sean just described, critics such as Philip Fisher, Walter Ben Michaels, Eric Sundquist, Sharon Cameron, Skip Gates from time to time, Greenblatt himself, produced bravura readings that reanimated familiar text and brought to consciousness glimmering new objects of desire. But even in these remarkable books and essays, the self continues to be figured as contained by power, both the object and the subject of discourse and of language. New historicists continually wrestled with the possibility of escape from the prison house of language, subversion, a constant theme of their work. The formulation contained by but subversive of was invoked again and again and again and again to the point of self-parody. But their work never made fully clear what subversion might involve other than the recognition of containment. Here the notion of culture, especially as it was deployed by anthropologists such as Clifford Geertz, Jim Clifford, Paul Rabenau, enters into the equation. For these writers, criticism was best understood as a representation of cultural practices, a discursive space within which paradigmatic structures of thought and feeling might be recognized and interrogated. But still pervasive was the sense that however privileged insights may be, they are no threat to power. The subversion they imagine is always already contained. Enter David Reynolds beneath the American Renaissance, the subversive imagination in the age of Emerson and Whitman. Reynolds acknowledges the history I've just recapitulated in his title and his subtitle, and I would note as well in a nod to Henry Nash Smith and his acknowledgments. He maintains Matheson's commitment to great works composed in a tightly focused space and time. The writers he chooses are white, and with the exception of Emily Dickinson, male. He preserves Matheson's commitment to common threads and purposes, his nationalistic impulse, the coherence of the great work of art, the distinction between high and low, but at the same time, he complicates that monolithic understanding, and he does so quite brilliantly. What at first looks like old historicism, the privilege of social context, which in David's words seeps through the pores of a writer's skin, an explicit rejection of formalism and an emphasis on context and on the spirit of the age, a belief in a stable historical frame with identifiable forms and features, all of that's there. But Reynolds' premise both acknowledges and challenges the regnant critical verities of the day. Here it is, David's words. The emergence of America's national literature in the first half of the 19th century resulted in large part from a dramatic shift in the rhetorical strategies of popular texts. Many different kinds of social texts suddenly lost their semiotic equivalencies and became colored by a radical infusion of the imaginative. Advancing richly nuanced readings of popular sermons, reform tracts, city mysteries, domestic novels, popular humor. I second Sean's notion that David has read more stuff than anybody I've ever met. He reconnected high literary forms with their social groundings, but far more important, he deployed the resultant genealogy he constructs to tease out the subversive aspects of those texts that had become either the rarefied monuments of dead white men, set in opposition to the non-canonical and the recuperated, or the impotent representations of all human efforts to speak from outside the cage. As Reynolds writes of the age, on all fronts it seemed that signifiers were being harshly torn from signified, as religious, political, and even journalistic science suddenly lacked reliable reference. By tracing that sense of radical dislocation in both popular and high literary culture, Reynolds restores to being the tumultuous collision of dominant, residual, and emergent modes of thought in the antebellum period, and he choreographs those three conceptions, those three structures, in a really brilliant dance. Rather than as reading the writers of the High Renaissance as rebels against a platitudinous and feminized culture, to use Ann Douglas's term, Reynolds reads Melville, Hawthorne, Poe, Dickinson, Whitman, Thoreau, and Emerson as nourished by a wide range of popular writing, immediately engaged with what he calls the horrific and turbulent aspects of perceived reality in the New Republic. The resultant richness is compelling from a theoretical and critical point of view, of course, but more to the point, it reanimates a form of critical practice that had entered a blind alley. Reynolds reclaims the mantle of Matheson, the sense of pleasure and wonder that draws us to the literary in the first instance, along with the social engagement that marked Matheson's practice. But he does so while incorporating and modifying regnant critical forms. He carries this through the remarkable roster of subsequent books, his studies of Whitman, Stowe, John Brown, Jacksonian America, each marked with a respect for the archive, a willingness to do the hard work of reading, and for the well-framed sentence. Always a pleasure to engage David on the page. Individually, each of these books richly informs our sense of their subject. Collectively, they have altered our sense of the age. David, I'm grateful for your work, and I salute a remarkable career that continues with undiminished vigor. Thank you very much, and again, I apologize for the departure.
Thank you. First things first, David, congratulations. I think that the more remarkable thing than the victory that is beneath the American Renaissance is that that was done 25 years ago, and you didn't have the willingness to just stop and let everybody else catch up with you. The productivity of your career has been is inspiring to me personally. It really is. I know it takes great strength and great courage. So, mazel tov. As a student eagerly struggling to produce a dissertation and later a book on early African American writing, I looked up one day to find that I was surprisingly, even shockingly, uninterested in the most privileged objects of my chosen field. I had no particular taste for what was known as literature. This was though I had become aware of and fascinated by a wealth of writing by African American persons, slave narratives, newspapers, political tracts, plays, poetry, and 4 novels, all of which had been produced between 1827, when slavery ended in New York State, and the first African American newspapers, and also the first African American newspaper, Freedom's Journal, was published in 1860, with the beginning of the Civil War and the publication of the first installments of Martin Delaney's serialized novel, Blake, or The Huts of America. I say that I was not interested in literature because none of these works had, or I'm not certain that they have, attached to them the cultural apparatuses that distinguish the subliterary from the literary. With the exception of Frederick Douglass's narratives and perhaps Harry Jacobs's 1861 narrative Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, no work by an African American writer published before the latter part of the 19th century could be said, at least at that time, to rest comfortably under the rubric of American literature. Indeed, the narratives surrounding the American Renaissance were at once so brittle, and I don't mean the writers now, I mean the ways that we've defined it. Indeed, the narratives surrounding the American Renaissance were at once so brittle and so thin that they tended to delimit possibilities for exciting work in 19th century American literary and cultural studies. The story with which we are all familiar is that from approximately 1850 to 1860, the founding texts of the modern American literary imagination, the Scarlet Letter, the House of Seven Gables, Representative Men, Moby Dick, and Leaves of Grass, appeared in rapid succession. They represented the maturation of a specifically American literary and cultural elite, one capable of building upon the great wealth of British, French, and German literatures to which they had been thoroughly exposed, while also representing the peculiarity and resistance to tradition that typified American culture. The problem, of course, was that this conception of American literature and American literary history proved to be both incredibly dull and stunningly narrow. Generations of American students were trained to approach Moby Dick as less a living text, the great Moby Dick no less, as less a living text to be unpacked than a talisman before which one was obliged to genuflect, making it of it a work whose literary status was maintained by its being an inert object, a thing incapable of broadcasting one message, a thing capable of broadcasting one message and one message only, the stunning reality of American genius. I'm not stunned by American genius, but I'm sorry. Moreover, sometimes I'm stunned by it. Sometimes I'm stunned by it, in fact. Moreover, as this conception of literature proved to be only marginally and hesitantly experimental, inclusive, or democratic, those of us working with extra or sub-literary artifacts found that our efforts were imagined as adding to knowledge formations saddled with ugly names like history, sociology, anthropology, and the ever-suspect cultural studies, while the literary remained a conservative, inwardly focused field of study. Indeed, though my bags were often loaded with old novels, I assumed and frankly continue to assume that literary study per se is often based in a series of rather dully familiar rejections and exceptions. American literature of the 19th century rejects most female writers, still, save Harry Beecher Stowe and Emily Dickinson and some others. Most African American authors, with the possible exception, of course, of Frederick Douglass, and almost all of the subversive writing that so interests David Reynolds and beneath the American Renaissance. That is to say, the lion's share of 19th century humorous and religious writing, sensationalist journalism, and feminist pamphleteering remains even today stunningly under-examined by scholars of American literature and culture. Moreover, one of the discouraging realities of contemporary graduate education is that because of a general lack of proper funding for research and a strong desire to produce individuals perfectly prepared for consumption within a rather ill-defined market, it becomes difficult to encourage apprentice scholars to devote themselves to the identification and retrieval of writing that has not been identified already as properly literary and therefore properly digestible within our often quite rigid intellectual and cultural institutions. Or to state the matter from another direction, though we all give rather impressive lip service to interdisciplinarity and to a certain intellectual promiscuity, it is nonetheless still the case that we continue to train students, those for all of us, I'm assuming, train students and hire colleagues within woefully outdated and inadequate categories of literature and the literary. Reading David Reynolds in 1991 in an impressively hot, if depressingly dark Brooklyn apartment had the effect of turning an already grouchy graduate student even grouchier. I had realized already that there was a fiercely maintained divide between what counted as African-American literature and plain American literature. I understood that people doing the type of work that interested me were charged with immersing themselves within so-called emergent fields, while also being forced to demonstrate their facility with canonical works. This was, though, it was certainly the case when I was in graduate school, which now I realize was in fact in olden times. But that it was, though, that there were many of students who were writing quite serviceable dissertations on Emerson or maybe Dickinson, without, frankly, seeming to notice that these individuals, Emerson and Dickinson, operated in much more complex ideological and conceptual arenas than what could be properly explained within the confines of even the most elite and most expansive Department of English. What I had not realized, however, was that the alarming marginalization of works by African-American authors within American literary studies was in fact part of a larger and much more insidious set of practices that allowed us to obscure the politically and ideologically charged, if often mechanistic, ways in which we distinguish literary text from simple writing. It is largely because of my exposure to David Reynolds' work that I became fascinated by the instrumental means by which taste and culture are adjudicated. Beneath the American Renaissance led me to, among other texts, John Guillory's excellent 1993 study, Cultural Capital, The Problem of Literary Canon Formation, Pierre Bourdieu's 1984 work, Distinction, A Social Critique of the Judgment of Taste, and then later Hazel Carby's 1987 Reconstructing Womanhood, the emergence of the Afro-American woman novelist, Paul Gilroy's 1993 Black Reconstruction, Modernity and Double Consciousness. And most important for me, a series of deeply suggestive interventions by Stuart Hall on the knotted relationship between taste, culture, and politics, particularly Gramsci's relevance for the study of race and ethnicity, which I think Stuart Hall and I are the only people who have read, and Hall's justifiably famous essay that I encourage all of you to read, Race, Articulation, and Society, Structured and Dominance, which I'm sure many of you have. Not to assign too much blame to David Reynolds, though I do have to say it is in fact the case that I was well on my way to being a perfectly reasonable scholar of literature. And then I read, among other things, Beneath the American Renaissance, and this happened. So to assign plenty of blame to David Reynolds, I'll change that. But his work operated for me as a somewhat unlikely part of a sort of stunningly wobbly apparatus that I was constructing in order to critique the role of what I believe to be so-called literature within American society, particularly within American universities. The book gave me material I needed to realize that though I'm very interested, deeply interested in writing narrative, form, and poetics, I may in fact be opposed to the very concept of literature and the literary. I definitely believe that much within literary criticism is obviously marred by a sort of critical timidity, a desire to recognize certain types of talent and inspiration, while often ignoring others. A desire that I believe is motivated as much by will to maintain a certain set of professional prerogatives as to add significantly to the reserve of human knowledge. The punchline for me, then, is that the fierce generosity of works like Beneath the American Renaissance has had the effect of destabilizing some of the most sacred shibboleths of the American literary apparatus. And I do, all joking aside, I do believe that one of the things that happened around David and a set of scholars in the late 80s and early 90s in this country is that they established a basis for a lot of the very difficult questions with which we are dealing now. Once one accepts, as Reynolds argues, that the most well-known of American Renaissance writers drew heavily from sub-literary forms in the production of their texts, then we're forced to re-examine how and why the process of canonization, the process of judging some texts as literary and others as something distinct, still seems so necessary within many cultural institutions. One might push this claim further by noting that it is only, that not only is the notion of literature highly suspect, but also the articulation of the various sub-disciplinary fields, the way that we divide up literature are quite questionable to me. American Victorian Renaissance, I know that a lot of the new work that is happening among many of us is pressing beyond those notions. I would say, in fact, that part of the reason that so-called African-American literature has never been fully integrated into American literature, with scare quotes around both, is that the African-American object is always understood as facing in at least two directions at once. Thus, it cannot sustain the coyness and aloofness that would allow it to be recognized as absolutely discreetly American or peculiarly literary. The broadly disruptive impact of Beneath the American Renaissance was part of a process by which humanistic study was shown to be perched on the most unstable of bases. On the one hand, from the 1970s forward, this country, literary critics, literary and cultural critics, and historians were fascinated by the work of Michel Foucault and his many students, who demonstrated that our conception of man itself had a very limited history, one that began with great ostentation in the 18th century only to find itself somewhat embarrassingly threadbare in the 21st. On the other hand, the interventions of people of color, feminist and racialized members of radicalized members of LGBT communities and racialized members of LGBT communities forced narratives of conquest, enslavement, colonization, resistance, and desire into elite precincts of American intellectual and academic life. These narratives have not exactly, at least to my mind, become dominant. That would in fact make them something else. But they have proven surprisingly vibrant in relation to the ideas that attend much of our most committed assumptions about how to categorize our endeavors as intellectuals. As a consequence, I can never muster exactly the necessary energy to be quite as alarmed as others are about some of the structural changes that university administrators love to refer to as the crisis of the humanities. I think that that's a lie, that people in the humanities need to not believe that lie anymore. There's a crisis of money that we didn't create, that we did not create. That is to say, more than anything, David Reynolds demonstrates not only a wealth of materials available to students of American literature and culture, those persons who are willing to do just a bit of digging, but also profoundly effective systems of intellectual consumption and exclusion that undergird everyday practices of the production of novels and the production of literature, and also criticism and canonization. As a consequence, humanistic study in American universities has an understanding of what actually, has, I think, a limited understanding of what actually, often has a limited understanding of what actually composes culture and society. Thus, in our defenses of the humanities, we ought to be absolutely careful that we are not again signing off on practices that are either ethically distasteful or intellectually suspect. I still have, I'll stop in a second, I still have a little bit of question about whether or not I even believe that there's an American Renaissance, but I'll concede that I realize that that argument is itself so old-fashioned that nobody really wants to hear it here. What unnerves me, however, is that I'm not at all certain that we've conceptually built as well as we might have upon the type of work that David Reynolds actually has done. Or to state it more precisely, while many individuals have attempted to broaden the range of text and context that we study within departments of literature, we've been consistently met with a resistance that privileges, I think, extremely limited groups of works and individuals within both our instruction and our criticism. Compare departments of English from today with those of 25 years ago, and you're likely to find much alarmist rhetoric, notwithstanding, frankly, that their curricula have changed, but they have not changed in radical ways. Thus, I'll say in ending that though I've said I don't necessarily like literature, I've learned to live with it, to ignore it, to treat it like bad neighbors with their garbage on the sidewalk. But I will say that once it enters the room, almost everything else becomes that much more difficult to see. Worse still, once a work of art has been deemed literary, the methods by which we might approach it become that much more restricted. I will leave you then with the suggestion that the legacy of Beneath the American Renaissance is that it forces us to recognize that much of what we do is specifically designed, it's specifically disciplinary. It's specifically about discipline, and in some ways to discipline and I think curtail the scope of our studies. Literature, as it is conventionally understood, however, does not have demographics on its side. In the early years of the 21st century, not only have the sheer number of extra literary text expanded exponentially, but also the assumptions surrounding what constitutes literature and the literary elite have been called into question in all quarters. Thank you.
You came back. Thank you. First of all, as everyone else has said, let me say that it's a great honor to be here on this august and somewhat surprising occasion. August, because as you've already heard quite a bit about the importance of David Reynolds' Beneath the American Renaissance, and surprising to me because I'm actually shocked at how many, that as many as 25 years have passed since it first appeared. Because I'm the caboose, pretty much the last person to speak today before you hear from David, I'm going to take a little bit of liberty and talk in part
in somewhat more personal terms of the great and lasting contribution, I think, of Beneath the American Renaissance. But to begin, and you've probably heard a lot of this already, David Reynolds in this book masterfully synthesizes what was named just 2 years after its appearance, the high and the low, high and low art in Kirk Varnedoe's controversial exhibit of that name at the Museum of Modern Art, where Picasso conversed with newspapers and Juan Miro with a comic book character, Crazy Cat. David Reynolds had preceded this exhibit by 2 years with his own investigation, and I quote, of the socio-literary milieu of literary works through the exploration of a broad array of social and imaginative texts. In other words, David Reynolds was not adhering, for instance, to the then fashionable theory of a literary unconscious that poked through the veneer of books such as Moby Dick or The Scarlet Letter, but rather demonstrated how, as he wrote, competing language and values systems openly at war on the level of popular culture actually provided the rich materials that writers such as Hawthorne, Poe, Whitman, or Dickinson adapted and transformed in their work. Put another way, the high and the low, the genteel and the sentimental, the political and the domestic, the word and the visual were not estranged from one another. They inhabited the same historical moment, and that moment was not one of candy box conventions, or not that alone, but was rife with sex and smut and guns and anger, populated by fallen women and comic jesters and political jeremiads, reform tracts, trial reports, and salacious penny newspapers, along with uplifting or apocalyptic sermons. Beneath the American Renaissance is thus a world of combinations. It's an enlarged world excavated with terrific energy by David Reynolds. There's nothing abstract here, and there's nothing finger-wagging. It's neither populist nor elitist in its examination of the received and the forgotten, and it's not polemical, or at least not more polemical than Whitman's polemical insistence in the preface to the 1855 edition of Leaves of Grass that the proof of a poet is that his country absorbs him as affectionately as he absorbed it. And so David Reynolds set as his task the discovery of how the poet or writer collided and tussled with a world largely ignored by other literary critics at the time, in which writers such as Melville or Poe transformed or used. To take one example, the lip-smacking, reverential rake, as David Reynolds calls the stock figure in 19th century sensational literature, enters Hawthorne's weak-kneed Dimmesdale in The Scarlet Letter, and certainly Emily Dickinson, as David Reynolds also writes, adapted images from a popular literature of misery and power in misery, which she revised stylistically and with a vengeance. My life had stood a loaded gun. This much you've heard today, that Beneath the American Renaissance closed a critical gap between a formalist and reverential literary criticism, in which a work on the one hand of literature, on the one hand was hailed as transcendent, and on the other was placed in the cultural and social history that sweeps that work within it and hears only a cacophony of cultural chatter. I know that for me, Beneath the American Renaissance let fresh air into the rigid walls of the academy, which I think Sean referred to as a penitentiary, which I'd already partly left by undertaking to write a biography of Janet Flanner. I'd never before written one, and I didn't care much about biographies, but I wanted to tell a story about modern history, expatriation, and a community of women, not canonized, whose lives and whose unusual writing did not fall within the contentious camps of academic criticism. For until I read Beneath the American Renaissance, I believed there could be no place for a writer committed to what had already become old-fashioned and at the same time, or so it seemed to me, much derided literary history. The New Americanists, as they were called at that time, around that time, by Frederick Crews's collective review of several works of literary scholarship, were avowedly political insofar as their project was a systematic undermining of Cold War consensus ideology as they found it in books like F.O. Matheson's American Renaissance, rightly interrogating what America meant and to whom, as well as the literary canon. These New Americanists were also new historicists, as we already heard today, which was distinct from the old historicists in that they claimed literature did not emerge from one presumably knowable context, but must be understood as a series of cultural codes that consist of the dominant and resistant ideologies within any particular text and within the reader of that text. I think the contribution David Reynolds made to literary studies is that without neglecting these theorists, with whom Reynolds was patently familiar, it nonetheless sidestepped the battle lines being drawn by them and struck out in a different direction. We can understand just how and why it did so, as well as the book's broader impact, if we look a bit at David's subsequent writing. In this regard, I'm thinking of his Walt Whitman's America, the book that in 1995 followed Beneath the American Renaissance, a book I've read many times and which begins, almost by way of implicit warning, with the remark that it's proved easier for critics to theorize about literary history than to write it. That said, Reynolds further explains that in this book he intends to overcome, quote, piecemeal, the word is Whitman's, piecemeal approaches to literary history by reconstructing the life and times of America's most representative poet, and at the close of Reynolds' book, he concludes that Whitman, quote, by fully absorbing his time, became a writer for all times. What Reynolds explores between the beginning and end, then, of Walt Whitman's America are precisely the terms and processes that absorption entails, and which is the life story of an artist fused with cultural history as if for the first time. Walt Whitman's America not only placed the poet next to the soprano Jenny Lind, whom Whitman thought too glitzy, or P.T. Barnum, who he interviewed, but also sent him to the killing fields near Fredericksburg and to the Union Hospital of Washington, where he mopped the brows of the wounded, and in Washington, where he later mourned the death of Abraham Lincoln in his great elegy When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloom. It showed how Whitman, the good gray poet, both ducked and did not duck the question of his own sexuality, how he adored and hated technology, how he sought celebrity and fashioned his own celebrated myth, and how this quote-unquote archetypal Democrat, as David called him, defended Andrew Johnson, whom he thought a good man, appalling to me, and then Rutherford B. Hayes, another highlight of history. Do I contradict myself? Whitman asked. Very well, then I contradict myself. The way that Whitman evolved soaked up his time and times, the way he tried to make his country absorb him. This cultural biography, quote unquote, the term is David's, demonstrates how the cultural, social, and aesthetic considerations raised by Beneath the American Renaissance anticipate Walt Whitman's America, where they are made visible, palpable, workable. For not only does Reynolds implicitly raise the question of what literary criticism is and can do, he also raises the same question regarding the form such literary criticism can take, and that form, as he demonstrates, can be biographic. So with a certain low-key assertion, he positions his book about Walt Whitman, which is a book about 19th century America, as cultural biography. A cultural biography, isn't all biography cultural? Well, as Reynolds implies, yes and no. And since I've already outlined the way in which we understand yes, let me speak to no. For I go so far as to suggest that before Reynolds' deliberate use in 1995 of the term cultural biography, biography was often considered, particularly in the academy, as a foundling, the stepchild of history and the embarrassing cousin of literary or other criticism, regressive and without the requisite theoretic foundations. Without getting too specific or technical, let me just generalize for a moment to say that for many years, literary decorum dictated we choose the tale over the teller. Who cares what Whitman thought of Queen Victoria, never mind Andrew Johnson, and what matter Melville's brutal treatment of his wife as long as he wrote The Confidence Man. Of course, women's subjects were accepted. Here, the teller trumped the tale, as in the case of Gertrude Stein, where too much ambition was considered an aesthetic failing. And recently, during the exhibit at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, of her and her brother's art collection, the Met encountered quite a bit of criticism for not including a statement about Stein's allegedly collaborationist activities during World War II when she remained in France. At another extreme, reigning critical theory more or less ignored biography when it didn't deplore it outright. Quoting from Roland Barthes, The Death of the Author, one hip critical theorist once said to me, "The death of the author, if only." Furthermore, biography's examination of one person's individual life opened it to disparagement as promoting the rampant and pernicious ideology of individualism. And of course, biography suffered and suffers from its not very tacit empiricism. Recently praising Stanley Crouch's new book on Charlie Parker, New York Times reviewer Dwight Garner said, "Mr. Crouch is not about getting his knees dirty, rooting around in old tax bills and manila folders and yellowing box office receipt. He's about aesthetics and ideas." That is, under the purview of biography, the individual stands tall. Neither aesthetics or ideas should exist. And history is merely a teleological and knowable collection of dusty documents. Hence, the need for cultural biography, presumably to fend off such naive assumptions. For as Reynolds points out implicitly, after and because of Beyond the American Renaissance, in his books about Whitman and on John Brown and Harriet Beecher Stowe, biography, like the best humanistic criticism, is hybrid genre, part history, part sociology, part aesthetic analysis, part excavation, part recovery, part getting one's knees dirty. David has tracked literature, its form and meaning, and the impulse of its makers, in the complex traces of its production. He sought it in the house, the yard, the school, under the bed, and in the closet, among the discards and the refuse, the placards, the newspapers, the courts, and the daybooks, in the metaphors and in the medicine cabinet, the propaganda and the publicity. To be sure, particular lives took place among these products and practices. Whitman's life and his work do not exist in the ethereal abstract, but piecemeal, at the supper table and the library table, or along the muddy streets of Washington and the back streets of Southold, and during Lincoln's second inaugural. Cultural practices, aesthetics, and personal choice converge in such mundane matters as cold water baths, the Davy Crockett manuals, the page proofs of Leaves of Grass, and in phrenology, spiritualism, Harriet Wilson's Our Nig, and a book called The Record of Crimes in the United States. Here history is in and all around us, forever out of reach, perhaps just beneath the polished surface, but goading us forward and backward, which is where we're always going, and which, in Beneath the American Renaissance and beyond it, David Reynolds cogently and brilliantly asks us to recognize and to relish and to remember, as if, and perhaps for the first, but not surely for the last time. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I want to thank the Graduate Center of the City University of New York and Chancellor Bill Kelly for putting on this event, and also to thank the others who were involved in it, including Paul Fess and the English Student Association. Appreciate their work a lot. The English and American Studies programs, Revolutionizing American Studies, the Center for the Humanities, and the Gilder Lehrman Institute. I thank all of you, also for all of you for coming out today. And I welcome our C-SPAN audience as well, and our live stream audience. I'm truly humbled to be up here with Annette, Robert, Sean, and Brenda Bill has left us now, but scholars who have taught me so much and who never cease to inspire me. It so happens that this very month is the 25th birthday or anniversary of Beneath the American Renaissance, which was first published by Knopf in October '88, and has since been reprinted twice in paperback, once by Harvard and recently by Oxford. The bottom one is the recent edition. By the way, seven of my books are being raffled off. If you have a ticket, you can somehow, I think Paul Fess is coordinating that, but they're over there on the table. If you don't want them, you can hand them over as gifts or something like that. Anyway, so I signed the copies. Back in '88, as a youngster, not that young, but anyway, climbing the promotional ladder, I was not looking decades down the road for Beneath the American Renaissance, nor did I dream that one of my other books, in addition to Walt Whitman's poetry, would end up being the big clue in a series called Breaking Bad. That book was not meant to be read by Hank Schrader in the bathroom, with toilet paper in one hand and my book in the other hand. Anyway, looking back on Beneath the American Renaissance, I see the ideas behind it had begun to percolate in the '70s. That really is a long time ago. While I was in the doctoral program at Berkeley, I took a seminar in pre-1900 American popular culture from one of the pioneers of American studies, Henry Nash Smith. I previously studied with Leo Marx and studied with Henry Nash Smith. And we read a number of once popular texts that aroused my curiosity about the vast terrain of unfamiliar writings in the American past. And that led to my dissertation, which became my first book, Faith and Fiction, which deals with some 250 writers of religious literature from Puritan times up to the early 20th century, a lot of 18th and early 19th century in there. And in that book, I discovered many neglected authors who soon became central, as Sean said, a lot of people were beginning to read this kind of thing, soon became central in the so-called revolution in cultural studies with its interest in the non-canonical, the marginal, the subaltern. And in my further research, I surveyed the entire range of pre-1865 popular writings, and I found much of it to be surprisingly dark, sensational, or politically radical. It frequently flouted gender norms, disrupted social hierarchies, and broke down dualisms like humans versus animals, humans versus things, in a style that was often disjointed and pre-modernistic. My next two books after Faith and Fiction were about an especially subversive author, the Philadelphia novelist George Lepart. All this led to my fourth book, Beneath the American Renaissance, in which I show how the energies of subversive popular culture infiltrated the familiar writings of 7 major American authors, contrary to the long-standing view, ever since F.O. Matheson, of Melville, Hawthorne, Dickinson, and others as alienated from their society. I found that the richness of their works actually owed much to their extraordinarily openness to the often experimental and adventurous American popular culture around them. In the years I was writing Beneath the American Renaissance, literary theory was mushrooming and boundaries between disciplines were dissolving. Although I shared the interdisciplinary spirit that informed theory, I was alarmed by the erasure of human agency that the post-structuralist move often involved. Barth's declaration about the death of the author was mentioned by Brenda. Foucault's notion of the author function often yielded jargon-clogged literary criticism in which the author was neglected altogether. And so my move in Beneath the American Renaissance and in my later books was to reach across the disciplinary divide to social, cultural, and political history, to treat authors and others as people entangled in real issues and the actual discourses and events of their time. Melville once pointed out that Shakespeare in his day wasn't Shakespeare. He was Master William Shakespeare churning out plays for the Globe Theater while being excoriated as an upstart crow in other birds' feathers. And as I reminded readers, Melville in his day wasn't Melville. He was Herman Melville, scratching by with his growing family, trying to escape his financial dependency on his father-in-law by writing novels that, as I shown beneath, are filled with popular cultural images. Emerson and Thoreau, as lecturers, had a keen eye on their Lyceum audiences, and even as they meditated on philosophy, they were caught up in social issues such as Native American removal, the environment, and slavery. Walt Whitman, who emerged out of popular journalism, tried to heal a fractured American society in his poetry while he served as the psychological rudder of his problematic family. Emily Dickinson, who had to deal with her uptight New England family, furtively read newspapers and popular novels that provided images and themes for her experimental poetry. These authors, in short, were defined precisely by their ability to respond creatively and thoughtfully to their real-life surroundings. For them, culture was not something out there on the margins. It was a universal essence that permeated the private space and the individual psyche. As Emerson wrote, and this was quoted earlier, the ideas of the time are in the air and affect all who breathe it. We learn of our contemporaries without effort, almost through the pores of our skin. The books I've written since then on people like Whitman and Stowe and John Brown had taken me further into realms I began to explore in beneath the American Renaissance, gender and race and slavery, religion, book history, and have carried me into other areas, including science and politics and music, theater, minstrelsy, art, photography, advertising, film, and graphic art. And I'm finding that such phenomena never operate in isolation. They're always interacting and blending and creating new formations that affect individuals and help bring about social change. I've learned from several critical trends that have emerged since the first publication of Beneath the American Renaissance. In my yearly updates of American criticism that I do for the Oxford Bibliography Online, I describe more than 20 different current approaches to American literature, all of which I find important. I just want to briefly address a few of these approaches. First, the digital humanities, or DH. The aspect of DH I find especially useful is the online archive. To do research for Beneath the American Renaissance, I had to spend years in libraries, poring over old books, pamphlets, newspapers. Now, there's nothing to replace an actual library and an actual archive, especially because it's so revealing to examine those books as artifacts, as physical artifacts. But I must say that the availability today of so many of these rare books online is a godsend for me and for many others who are joining in the effort to reconstruct fully America's and other nations' literary and cultural past. Another area where my approach intersects with current trends, I think, is what's being called the new formalism or new aestheticism. My argument about how all realms of culture intertwine and are refashioned by the creative imagination accords with efforts by the new formalists to combine close reading with historicism, cognitive psychology, and aesthetics. Some might ask, isn't literature as much transnational as it is national? Actually, I've been interested in transnational, circumatlantic, and global themes for a long time, ever since Faith and Fiction and Beneath the American Renaissance, in which I discuss the popularity in America of so-called Oriental tales, and I've discussed in my recent books Haiti, England, continental Europe in relation to the US. Having said that, I think it's important to keep in mind the unmistakable imprint that a specific nation and a specific time and place leave on a literary work. Many of the works that come closest to achieving global status are those that are the most deeply saturated in the discourses of their own culture, discourses that gain unique expression when they're filtered through the individual creative imagination. Ahab's dying words about a sinking ship, its wood could only be American, speaks to the fact that Moby Dick, with all its roots in deep time and transatlantic writing, draws broadly as well from many specifically American cultural phenomena and from Melville's own experiences as a sailor. Emerson, even with his debt to classical and European philosophy, famously declared that American authors must, quote, chant our own time and circumstances. Then he gives his long list of the log rolling and the Native Americans and on and on. Walt Whitman brandished the fact that he had effectively absorbed his nation, so much so that in the very first of his 3 anonymously published self-reviews, he had friends in newspapers. It must be nice to be able to review your own books. Anyway, he began, the very first line, an American bard at last, an American bard at last. And here I am, you know. And literatures in different parts of the world are similarly stamped by their own national identities. What would Ulysses be without the discourses and context of Joyce's Ireland, or Madame Bovary without the French provincial culture that Flaubert knew so well, or Proust without Cambrai, Virginia Woolf without Cornwall and London, or Chinua Achebe without Nigerian folklore, and on and on and on. And so in our embrace of the transatlantic and global, which I heartily endorse, we can't forget the national and personal origins that are, after all, essential features of many literary works, no matter where they're written. I'm going to conclude with a few remarks about what I see as the role of the humanities today. I was recently at a comparative literature conference in Paris where the keynote speaker suggested that in our increasingly technocratic, pragmatic society, the humanities should go into kind of defensive bunker mode and make its case against the sciences. But my view is that we should try to shake hands with science, as a number of scholars, in fact, are doing. Besides DH, fields that offer outreach to science include eco-criticism, animal studies, disability studies, and the field of literature and medicine. We live in a time when the humanities are under real threat, and I'm talking about the threat that Robert talked about. Public funding for the humanities is being slashed. The NEH Fellowship Beneath the American Renaissance, and other books like Kathy Davidson's Revolution in the Word, but some of the other books were written under that particular fellowship, is apparently on the chopping block. And both the NEA and NEH, of course, they went out during the shutdown, but even now they're kind of limping along, and apparently they're headed for big slashing. Will they fully recover ever? Well, many Americans see the humanities as one of the first places to cut. And so unless we humanists adapt to the current environment, we may lose not only Big Bird, as was said in the last presidential race, but also some big books that would otherwise have been made possible through federal support. I believe that we can combat the sidelining of the humanities by making our writings vital and viable to the larger world in whatever way possible, and to bring to bear the expansive vision that the humanities can offer. Indeed, humanists are needed now more than ever to challenge not only the arcane over-specialization in academia, but also the narrowness and extremism that are all too prevalent in America today. My own effort in Beneath the American Renaissance and my other books has been to try to represent the entire American experience from the grassroots up, including all varieties of writers, to show how the most energetic forces in popular culture have been rechanneled and refashioned in timeless works of literature. Thank you very much.
I was going to say a few words, but I forfeited that by coming late. So I would like to take questions. We would like to take questions from the audience. Would you, first, is there anything that you guys would like to say to one another, or do you want to throw it up to people out there?
Hi.
Are you just waving? Is that addressing people? Any questions? You could state who you are, and someone must have a question.
And the most important thing you do, Dave, you believe in talent. But it seems to me
Excuse me, man, announce Stanley Crouch.
yeah, but I think the fact that you believe in talent is, to me, the most important thing you do, to bring all these forces together. Because there are people who are talented in every arena. Most people aren't. The question is how well people can recognize and relate that to talent. Because it seems to me like the academic position now is, well, we don't know if real things such as talent. It's just circumstances, it's money, it's influences. That's a bunch of bullshit. See, because if you have talent, everybody knows it, particularly the people who do what you do. See, there was never any question among musicians that Mozart was talented, that Louis Armstrong was talented, No, there's never a question about that. But once you have an industry called the academy, then people have to get jobs. So they get jobs by starting things. And what I like about your work is it stays focused on the talent of the people you're talking about. Because with Harry Beecher Stowe, with John Brown, see, because you actually make the data come alive. Your work isn't destroyed by data. You got a lot of data in there. It's a lot of it. But you make it feel like it's part of the era of the time. That the people actually enter the time. It's not if you think, well, such and such a year, 17 people went to such and such a point. Nobody cares about that. But when you take a fact, you actually do what it seems to me a real biographer should be able to do, or a cultural historian, or whatever you want to call it. They have to be able to bring the information alive. Sean Wilentz knows what it is. Anybody who can do it, they know what it is. See, because all of us can get the facts, and we can do what most people do with the facts. Take them, there you go. But, like that book, like Mightier Than the Sword is so startling because you actually make people, a reader, feel the time. Feel that that's the way things were going at that time. And see, to me, that's they just use so many adjectives today, like magical, genius. Oh man, but you do. You have real talent. And you know how to focus it on other people who have talent.
Well,
and you're not afraid of the idea.
Well, that's kind of what I was going to say about Harry, the Mightier Than the Sword. I mean, and it's clear from all of the things that were said today why he was the perfect person to do that, because you get a very clear sense of what Stowe is doing, what she had to do in order to produce that work, and that's the brilliance of the book. His talent and recognizing the talent in other people, and being able to bring that to the reader, make that clear to the reader. Another question? Nothing among the panels? Well,
I ask them questions.
Sure.
I'm sorry.
Speaking with graduate students here, and just the fact that you had some of the students here who read the books, and the idea of, beneath that there is excitement. Academic studies become more relevant very quickly, and you just remind that, and I agree with our point too, that there's still a lot of stuff that hasn't been read and still in the archives, and that's where a lot of the excitement in literary studies still lies, and I think a lot of your students, like myself, came out of that and learned a lot, and were listening, and it's been pretty great.
Yeah, I don't know if these microphones are working. Anyway, yeah, I mean, I think a whole new beneath the American Renaissance and beneath the 18th century and everything could be written without necessarily even mentioning too much of what I mentioned. Why? Because to me, it's like an endless sea of energy. Now, I tap in beneath into certain energies, but there are so many other energies that are very, very important out there. And I always encourage my students, because a lot of people read my work and say, well, you've covered everything. And I said, you know what Melville said about life? The trillionth part has not been said. The trillionth part has not been said. I mean, there's so much out there to, particularly nowadays, and Brenda and I were talking about this beforehand, with this online archive. Now there are thousands and thousands of newspapers and books online that can really, really help you reconstruct a culture. And it seems to me that there's so much more work to be done. Maybe Brenda, you can comment on this.
Not on that directly, but as David was speaking, I began to think of the question of context, and it really speaks to what David is talking about, and the energies of context and how contexts disappear, even in our own time. I have two examples that may not mean anything to anybody who's, I don't know, under 30 here, but for those of you who aren't like myself, the two contexts are both from teaching experiences that I had. Once when I was teaching Elizabeth Bishop poem, love Elizabeth Bishop, I love her poetry, and the name of the poem was At the Filling Station. And I'm sorry?
Louder.
Louder. The name of the poem was At the Filling Station. And one intrepid student raised his or her hand, I don't remember now, and said to me, "What's a filling station?" That was a little while, ago, and more recently, I was again teaching, and I was talking about how some writers, different writers use different techniques just in getting words on pages. Some people use yellow sheets and longhand. Some compose directly on the computer, and I have a friend who uses only a Smith Corona electric, and he has a whole warehouse of them. People know who he is. He's rather well known, and every time he mentions it, somebody sends him a new Smith Corona electric. Another student raised a hand and said, "What's a Smith Corona electric?" Because I hadn't said Smith Corona electric typewriter. And to me, it was a stunning shock.
Well,
and
they wouldn't know what a typewriter. I've seen people look in amazement at a typewriter, like, what do they think of next?
But that's the point. And that's in my own time, and perhaps some of yours. That's the point. And so if you just roll back 100 years, 150 years, 1,000 years, you imagine what is lost in just that kind of vernacular. And one of the achievements of David's work and what we're talking about here are those energies, trying to find them and somehow relocate them and figure out what it was when there was a world where Smith Corona electric meant something. I coveted one, so to me it was a big deal. And here it was gone, it was obsolete. And I'm sure we all have examples from our own lifetimes where we can see energies do dissipate. And so but that doesn't mean they did not exist.
Sean, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I wanted to ask an historian's question. Is this thing on at all? I'll shout.
I think you have to turn it on, maybe? There's a switch here.
Oh, yeah?
Is that any better?
No, I don't think they're on.
I just want to say the question I've always meant to ask you, or I've long time on this, which is about history and writing about writers, and writing about non-writers. I mean, John Brown didn't write a whole lot. I've done a little bit. I've written about non-writers too, but I was curious what your take was. Is it different? It must be different. How is it different, and how do you see the two as connected?
That's a very good question. Well,
Did people hear his question?
Everybody hear that?
Okay.
Okay.
Writing about historical figures as opposed to writing about writers. I mean, in a way, I think in this sense I am influenced by discourse theory, the idea that all of our brains are influenced by outside discourse. And Emerson's idea that the ideas kind of seep through our skins, almost like air, and we breathe in our contemporary environment almost without knowing it. To me, that applies both to writers like Walt Whitman, who had an especially broad array of feelers into his environment, because even though he only went to school to age 11, he still was so curious about the world that he knew about kind of everything from phrenology to pseudoscience. I mean, his poetry is a repository. That's why he's only second only to Shakespeare in the number of different vocabulary words that he uses. Or Abraham Lincoln, who's a historical figure, could recite Shakespeare by the page because he had intrinsic curiosity about the world around him, and he would literally read Shakespeare and love Shakespeare, and be able, and he would also tell endless stories that he heard. So for me, it's not always that much different. To me, and John Brown is someone who Henry David Thoreau said that it wasn't really his rifles that counted. It was his words. And it was his words when he was in prison, and these pro-slavery people kept on reprinting John Brown's words, thinking how silly these words are. They're so ridiculous. He wants to give his life for black people. Are you kidding me? This guy's crazy. And yet those words shot around the world. And then Emerson said that John Brown's speech was second only to the Gettysburg Address in being the greatest American speech. So sometimes historical actors themselves, or Lincoln really lives to us through his words, through the Lincoln-Douglas debates, through the Gettysburg Address. So to me, discourse is always there, at least to some degree, in the greatest historical actors, just as they are in writers. The difference, I think, with writers and with great geniuses is that they're even more comprehensive, it seems to me, in their absorption of all these different discourses. Walt Whitman had everything from sensationalism to sentimentalism to phrenology to, and you could go on and on to almost certain women's issues, gender issues, and in this effort to kind of absorb. And it seems to me these, Emerson once said, the genius like Shakespeare is the one who can traverse the entire realm of experience. Traverse the entire realm of experience and kind of bring everything into focus in a particular work of genius. He talked about Shakespeare, and he said that what Shakespeare would do, he would rummage among the scraps of the old Elizabethan plays, the waste scrap of it. He would rummage around in it, and he got all these images and themes and characters, and then conveyed them through symbols and through language and through discourse that was organized. And it seems to me that the greatest writers like Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson does the same thing as well. And I think Lincoln at his very best does this as well too. Lincoln to me though brings the different thing of the rational, I mean the lawyerly. He tried, I don't know how many hundreds of cases that he tried as a lawyer, but he kind of fuses this kind of almost mythic, knowledge of the American experience and the principle behind what equality is with this kind of very sort of legal mind that particularly comes out in the Cooper Union Address, it seems to me, and also the Lincoln-Douglas debate. And then he had this ability also to condense, for example, in the second inaugural, condense in these very short, pithy speeches the kind of essence of the American principle. And yet, so I think discourse is really, really important for both historical actors and for writers.
Yeah, and lawyering is storytelling. I mean, he was a great lawyer, and that stood him in good stead.
Yeah.
I have a question I'll direct to Robert, but I'd like David's response to it as well. Robert, I understand what you're saying about your boredom to the literature. Regretful dislike. I get that to the extent that, you're arguing for more inclusive and non-canonical range here. But I wonder how much of that's about hostility to what has been defined as the literary, and how that jives with David's interest in the
I don't know that I can't answer this.
I'm asking David to answer the second question.
I think that one of the things that concerns me is that there is a real challenge to how our fields are established and what the need, particularly for departments of literature, are going to be as the 21st century goes forward. I agree, by the way, that it seems to me that we have very, very strong arguments to make about what we actually can and cannot do. I'm not certain that those arguments can be based on an idea that we have to protect a tradition of literature that is already established. I think you can do that, but you have to do it in conjunction with the idea that we're also interested in the very idea of what is literature and the literary, and that we're not necessarily committed to making that distinction going forward. I don't know I really frankly don't know that the majority of what Americans are reading in terms of their fiction ever gets to count as literature. And therefore, there's a way in which we're often talking about as professionals in the field, things that are very far afield from what people are imagining as being from fiction and poetry that is actually being consumed by folks. I can tell you certainly any old New Yorker can be very clear about the fact that what's being consumed by folks sitting to you next on that you're sitting next to on the subway is in fact very often not what's being taught and referred to in classrooms. I think you have to have some type of balance with that. Also, a little bit for me, it has to do with archives. And I just wanted to say one thing about one of the things that really concerns me, and especially today, I think that it's really significant, is that archives in this country are under also an amazing amount of pressure. And so the part of the way that I think the logic of that works is that the reason that you say to extremely clever person working on a dissertation or very gifted scholar, go to the archives is not simply because they're going to find great text there, but they're going to find a lot of stuff that just never reaches the level of being the same as Moby Dick or the Scarlet Letter, and the Scarlet Letter never really reached that point. But if our focus is only on those texts that have already been canonized, I know that the canon is rapidly expanding. I think it could expand faster. But if that focus continues to be that way, then the question of what American culture actually is, how it is that you actually do understand how to read a text within its context, I think it's quite gummy. And my sense is that as things get tighter for us, it's easier for us to actually focus on things that have already been accepted, published, produced and reproduced, versus actually looking at all those things that stand around them. So I want to have a grouchier sort of attitude about the literary because I want other things to happen, especially as a person working in fields in which it's hard for even the majority of the things that are recognized as being literature and the literary in those fields to be recognized in other parts of the profession. So,
right. About the new formalism, I mean, I think what attracts me to that is that, for example, they love talking about comics. I mean, sort of anything is grist for this sort of new formalism. It seems to me it's not just Moby Dick. It's not just, the Scarlet Letter or something like that. I mean, it's a way of linking up popular culture, historicism, theory, cognitive psychology. Again, I don't want to praise it to the skies either. I'm just saying that it's kind of an interesting new movement. And it kind of resists the old new criticism. It's very, very unlike the old new criticism. And yet it allows you to talk in terms like chiasmus and anapora and all the tropes and all of that. But maybe you refer to a comic book or something like that. And also to discuss cognitive psychology and the authoring context as well. Because you asked me about the new format. As far as kind of the canon, I'm all for expanding the canon. Totally. I think I will say that when I was in the American Antiquarian Society doing research toward this book, I came upon a pamphlet novel about a mad captain chasing a white whale. Wasn't a white whale, but a whale, published just before Moby Dick. And I said, this is so exciting. I think it's called Lesson for Life. So I read this, and it was complete Dulesville. There was not an ounce of energy. And I said, well, what's going on here? It's the same, very similar plot, similar kinds of characters. And then I realized what was missing was what, frankly, I talked about beneath the American Renaissance. All those cultural energies, the old Southwest humor, the new religious style, the city mysteries, darkness, on and on, all these kind of images that are kind of woven into Moby Dick that were utterly lacking in this. The only word I can think is flat, a very flat, even though the narrative was quite similar. As I say, I think it's called Lesson for Life. Very exciting title.
No.
But
No wonder.
it probably sold better than Moby Dick at the time. Moby Dick only sold about 2,300 copies at the time, but it was one of these pamphlet novels. So I'm very much for opening up the canon, but at the same time, and I think, for example, about George Lepar's The Quaker City, I'm working on an article now, and I'm going through it's been taking me about two months. I've written 2 books on them apart, but it's taking me about 2 months just to reread the novel because just how incredibly dense that novel is and full of really interesting images. And that's a book that certainly should be canonized by now. If anything, it should be. There's so much going on there, and yet it's amazing to me that it's not more. Well, right now, Sari and a few of us are getting together. We're doing articles on it, but a lot of these things that we've been churning up, people prefer to do something else and maybe either rely on Moby Dick or maybe even not, whatever. It seems to me there's a lot of richness that's still out there. Emily Dickinson herself, of course, was a complete and utter unknown when she died, and then a bastardized edition of her rewritten with all the punctuation corrected and the cute little titles put on her poetry. She wasn't really known. That was published shortly after her death until Thomas H. Johnson came along and found her in the library in 1935. And suddenly this complete unknown is, people say this is really great stuff. And I don't want to necessarily make a hierarchy of text, but I will say that there are some texts that identifiably, and it's the same with slave narratives. I think it's right that, for example, the Frederick Douglass and the Harry Jacobs, to me, they really do stand out intrinsically a little more than, I've read so many slave narratives, and I mean, there's a lot kind of thickness in energy and subversive energy in a lot of those 2 texts in particular, and certain other works. Whereas some of the other slave narratives are very interesting and important in their own right, but maybe lack a kind of density or richness that you do find in let's say, the Frederick Douglass. So, anyway.
Some texts are better than others.
Yeah, David, I wonder if you talk about the survival value of academic books. Now, you're thinking about Renaissance, last 25 years. But given the fact
it's about to die. No, I know. Its funeral is today. No, just kidding.
And the thing on one hand, there are the pressures you talked about on the archive, the pressures, the shrinking of the publishers, the shrinking because of the attacks on humanity. That's one thing. Counter to that, you have this proliferation of books that academic books, that no one reads. Now, is that different? In other words, is the status different now because of the digital revolution and the fact that so much in the future will be published online, or has it always been the case? And some things will survive, and most things won't survive. Do you have any kind of wisdom?
Yes, I know every answer about that. Absolutely. I wish, the fate of a book is really, you kind of throw it out there and you hope for the best. Now, when I published Faith and Fiction back in '81, the average print run for a university press book back then was about 1,300 copies. Now the average print run for a university press book is about 300 or 350, something like that. And they can barely even sell it to libraries. Mm-hmm. So the circulation is just, and the price of the books as well. And so, and yet, you have to publish a book to get tenure, so there are a lot of university press books out there. There are a lot of, and it's harder and harder to get reviewed, particularly for university press books. Even in scholarly journals, the whole thing is shifting, but I think part of it is the tectonic change being created by the digital revolution. That so many people have academic blogs, for example, and they're publishing online. And it could be, I don't know, is the day approaching when academic books as we know it won't exist? I'm not quite sure. What I try to do in my own books is to reach for an academic audience, but also reach a little beyond that to some people, maybe general readers, a few who might be interested in culture, who I can talk to. And this is, when I ended my talk, this is what I was talking about, really. if we can kind of jump that divide in our prose, in our writing, to interest people that are a little bit outside of academe per se, and talk to them in some way, so that we can sustain all of us together, it seems to me, in our books, then maybe we can keep book publishing alive, so that it doesn't shrink so much that it becomes almost nothing, these kind of academic books. How do others feel about this? Any? Yeah.
No, I'm saying that I don't agree with this, but I agree because I was going to ask you actually when you were talking about humanists extending their hands to people in the sciences. I've wondered, and it's been somewhat addressed in this in the Q&A, how literary critics can speak to historians and vice versa. I mean, you're in the middle of it. What you're doing is literature history, cultural history, but this is, I think, a big problem. There are a lot of historians that like literature and they want to incorporate it into their work, but if they read literary criticism to get a sense of what's being said, well, at least I don't understand a lot of it. So when it comes to new formalism and that sort of thing, so.
Well, there's still a lot of compartmentalization within academia. The history department people do their thing over here, the English department people do and the comp lit over there, and the psychology over there. And there again, I think within academia, I think there should be a little more dialogue. And I'm very, very happy to be at this table with historians, biographers, and somebody who teaches at Harvard Law School and everything. I mean, it seems to me that any way that we can kind of bridge that gap between even intra-academe, it seems to me that's the beginning. And science is certainly one way. Yeah.
You had a question.
Thinking about, like, you're talking about the general audience, like, outside of academia, that's so broad, right? And for me, like there was before, I still feel like sometimes I'm outside of academia. I'm still an undergrad, right? And I remember being introduced to Poe and Rita and Godard and all these other, if I had the time to really sit down and read, really annotate and read and do all that, I still would not want to read them, let alone the publication of someone, from, wherever university was writing about them. It's just, there's a gap. Me personally, I still love comics, and it doesn't matter where it's from. It can be Japanese manga, it can be, DC comics, Argos comics, Marvel comics. And the reason I love those things when I was little is because they sort of introduced me to ideas, like philosophical ideas, right? So when I read something like Plato or Aristotle or whoever, I see Batman, and I feel like if you had more, references like that, people are like, I don't want to read those comics, they seem kind of ridiculous. But I mean, I remember I had a friend who just graduated from college, and he wrote his honors thesis on that. And it's like there are things like that. There's just not enough of that. There's not enough of a push on people who are in academia who want to stretch out and really pick up a comic book, pick up graphic novels, something like that. And you'd be surprised how many individuals will want to become English majors and feel like what they're reading is material.
I just want to talk about the thing about publishing. Suppose you abolished the PhD. Suppose you abolished the PhD dissertation, which I think would be a great idea myself. Save a lot of trees. Well, we don't have trees anymore. Save a lot of cyber something. But I don't think you have to publish a book. Most people who publish a dissertation never publish another thing again. It's not the mark of being a scholar necessarily, or of being a teacher. Not all of us are book writers. I know someone once told me, good, even great writers have their distances, right? There are 3,000 word people. There are 300,000 word people. There are marathon runners. There are sprinters, right? But those are the good writers. Most people don't have any of that. But it's not talent for that. It's not the only way you can be talented. So I think that if we abolish the PhD, that'll be one step. The second step would be to abolish peer-reviewed articles, which I think is the greatest, how should I put it, constraint on originality, on liveliness, on orthodoxy ever. I say that as someone who has never published a peer-review article, and I have tried.
You want to go into this a bit more about your hostility towards those?
No, you understand why, though. I mean, often you submit something, you get 5, 6, 7, 10 people writing in, all of them a cacophony. It ends up being strained it's like a puree at the end. Even the best of them. So that's my contribution to that argument.
Oh, maybe one more.
Yeah.
I want to go back to this idea of shaking hands with science, and then you brought up the point of reading other texts that are absolutely not thought of as literature, but then that brings to literature. I think part of the reason that the Academy is so isolated from everyone who reads, stuff from Barnes and Noble, for example, when they read and they have fun with it.
Stuff from Barnes and Noble.
Yeah.
There are lots of good things in Barnes and Noble.
They don't pay attention to what we're studying because it seems so ignorant. Because we in the Academy are not thinking of what we're studying as living texts, and we're not connecting to all of these other things. Like, for example, I'm reading a thesis right now on Jane Austen's sequels, and this was about like some amusement, but I think that those sequels written on Jane Austen's original text are sort of bridging a little bit back to our roots in how we study Jane Austen critically and how people approach Jane Austen. I know people who have come to Jane Austen after being introduced to one of those sequels. So, I lost my train of thought. So my point was, sort of, it was bridging the divide, yes, shaking hands with other disciplines, and we look at popular literature nowadays in like sort of just pure cultural sense, and we look at serious literature in another way.
Academia should be more open to bridging the gap and opening up, reaching out a hand to other people, to other areas that are not other people who are not within academia, in order to bring them forward so that everybody can enjoy a new canon, whatever the canon is supposed to be. Well, I think that we have to end there. That's a good way to end. This is what David's work has been about. And